Hello, and welcome to my channel. Learn English easily. Let's read a story.
I had come to Veracruz, from Mexico City, to catch a ship to Yucatan, and found that, a dock strike having been declared the previous night, my ship could not put in. I was stuck in Veracruz. I took a room in the Hotel Diligencias, overlooking the square, and spent the morning looking at the sights of the town. I wandered down side streets and peeped into quaint courts. I visited the parish church, which is very picturesque. Then I found that I had seen all that was to be seen, and I sat down in the coolness of the arcade that surrounded the square, and ordered a drink. The sun beat down on the square and dusty cocoa palms, mercilessly. Great black buzzards perched on them, for a moment, flew down on the ground to gather some bit of offal, and then flew up to the church tower. I watched the people crossing the square, Negroes, Indians, Spanish, they varied in color, from ebony to ivory. As the morning wore on the tables around me filled up, chiefly with men who had come to have a drink before luncheon. I had already bought the local paper, but the newsboys tried to sell me more copies of the same paper. I refused, 20 times at least, the boys who wanted to shine my spotless shoes. And having come to the end of my small change, I could only shake my head at the beggars who gave me no peace. Little Indian women, each one with a baby, tied in a shawl on her back, held out skinny hands to me. Blind men were led up to my table by small boys, cripples exhibited their deformities, and half-naked, hungry children endlessly demanded coppers. But suddenly, my attention was attracted by a beggar, who unlike the rest of them, and unlike the black-haired people sitting round me, had hair and beard of a red so vivid that it was startling. His beard was ragged, and his long hair looked as though it had not been brushed for months. He wore only a pair of trousers and a cotton singlet, but they were rags, dirty and foul, that barely held together. I have never seen anyone so thin. His legs, his naked arms, were skin and bone, and through the holes of his singlet, you saw every rib of his body. You could count the bones of his dust-covered feet. He was not old, he could not have been more than 40, and I wondered what had brought him to this state. It was absurd to think that he would not have worked if he had been able to get work. He was the only one of the beggars who did not speak. He said nothing. He did not even hold out his hand, he only looked at you, but with such wretchedness and despair in his eyes, it was dreadful. He stood on and on silently looking at you, and then, if you took no notice of him, he moved slowly to the next table. If he was given nothing, he showed neither disappointment nor anger. If someone offered him a coin, he stepped forward a little, held out his hand, took it without a word of thanks, and went his way. I had nothing to give him, and when he came to me, I shook my head, and used the polite formula with which the Spaniards refuse a beggar. But he paid no attention to what I said. He stood in front of me, for as long as he stood, at the other tables, looking at me with tragic eyes. There was something terrifying in his appearance. He did not look quite sane. At last he passed on. It was 1 o'clock, and I had lunch. When I awoke from my siesta, it was still very hot, but towards evening, a breath of air coming in through the window tempted me into the square. I sat down under my arcade and ordered a drink. Presently people began to fill up the tables in the restaurant, and the band began to play. And again bootblacks begged me to let them clean my shoes, newsboys pressed papers upon me, beggars demanded alms. I saw once more that strange, red-bearded fellow, and watched him stand before one table after another. He did not stop before mine. I suppose he remembered me from the morning, and having got nothing from me, then thought it useless to try again. You do not often see a red-haired Mexican, and I wondered if he could be a sailor, English, Scandinavian or American, who had deserted his ship, and by degrees had sunk to this pitiful condition. He disappeared. Since there was nothing else to do, I stayed on till I got hungry, and when I had eaten, I came back. I sat on till it was bedtime. I confess, the day had seemed long, and I wondered how many similar days I should be forced to spend there. But I woke after a little while, and could not get to sleep again. My room was stifling. I opened the shutters, and looked out at the church. There was no moon, but the bright stars faintly lit its outline. The buzzards gathered on the cross, above the cupola, and on the edges of the tower, and now and then they moved a little. The effect was uncanny. And then, I have no notion why, I remembered that red-haired fellow again, and I had suddenly a strange feeling that I had seen him before. It was so vivid that it drove away from me the possibility of sleep. I felt sure that I had come across him, but when and where I could not tell. As the dawn approached, it grew a little cooler, and I was able to sleep. I spent my second day at Vera Cruz, as I had spent the first. But I watched for the coming of the red-haired beggar, and as he stood at the tables near mine, I examined him with attention. I felt certain now that I had seen him somewhere. I even felt certain that I had known him and talked to him, but I still could recall none of the circumstances. Once more, he passed my table without stopping, and when his eyes met mine, I looked in them for some gleam of recollection. Nothing. I wondered if I had made a mistake. But I could not get out of my head the impression that at some moment he had entered into my life. I was sure now that he was either English or American. But I was shy of addressing him. The day wore on. Another day came, another morning, another evening. It was Sunday, and the square was more crowded than ever. The tables under the arcade were packed. As usual, the red-haired beggar came along, a terrifying figure in his silence, his rags, and his pitiful distress. He was standing in front of a table, only 2 from mine, when I saw the policeman, who at intervals tried to protect the public from all these beggars. He gave him a blow on the back. The beggar's thin body trembled, but he made no protest and showed no anger. He slowly walked away. Then suddenly I remembered. Not his name, that escaped me still, but everything else. He must have recognized me, for I have not changed very much in 20 years, and that was why after that first morning, he had never paused in front of my table. Yes, it was 20 years since I had known him. I was spending a winter in Rome, and every evening I used to dine in a restaurant in the Via Sistina, where you got excellent macaroni and a good bottle of wine. It was often visited by a group of English and American art students and 1 or 2 writers, and we used to stay late into the night engaged in endless arguments upon art and literature. He used to come in with a young painter who was a friend of his. He was only a boy, then he could not have been more than 22, and with his blue eyes, straight nose, and red hair he was pleasing to look at. I remembered that he spoke a great deal of Central America. He had had a job with the American Fruit Company, but had thrown it over because he wanted to be a writer. He was not popular among us, because he was arrogant. He thought us poor fish, and did not hesitate to tell us so. He would not show us his work, because our opinion meant nothing to him. His vanity was enormous. He was so certain of himself, that he infected some of his friends with his own assurance. I recalled his high spirits, his vitality, his confidence in the future. It was impossible that it was the same man, and yet I was sure of it. I stood up, paid for my drink, and went out into the square to find him. My thoughts were in a turmoil. I was aghast. I had thought of him now and then and wondered what had become of him. I never imagined that he could come to this dreadful state. This was awful. I asked myself what had happened. What disappointments shattered him and broke his spirit, what lost illusions ground him to the dust. I asked myself if nothing could be done. I walked round the square. He was not in the arcades. There was no hope of finding him in the crowd that circled round the bandstand. Evening was coming on, and I was afraid I had lost him. Then I passed the church, and saw him sitting on the steps. I cannot describe what a pitiful object he looked. Life had broken him, torn him limb from limb, and then flung him on the stone steps of that church. I went up to him. "Do you remember Rome?" I said. He didn't move. He didn't answer. He took no notice of me, as if I were not standing before him. He didn't look at me. His blue eyes rested on the buzzards that were screaming and tearing at some object at the bottom of the steps. I didn't know what to do. I took a yellow-backed note out of my pocket and pressed it in his hand. He didn't give it a glance. But his hand moved a little, his thin fingers closed on the note and crumpled it. Then he made it into a little ball and suddenly flicked it into the air, so that it fell among the screaming buzzards. I turned my head instinctively and saw one of them seize it in his beak and fly off. When I looked back, the man was gone. I stayed 3 more days in Vera Cruz. I never saw him again.
Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please don't forget to like it. You can subscribe and turn on notifications for more videos like this.